This is a think tank with Todd Johnson. And Todd, why don't you start by introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about you and your current position, and then maybe how you got into research.
Okay, I'm currently the director of the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, which is located on the campus of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in South Hamilton, Massachusetts, just north of Boston. And we study Christianity in every country of the world and the activities of Christians from every denomination, mission agency, and try to understand the extent of mission, evangelistic activities, financial activities, and all of those sort of things. I got involved in research really through the encouragement of Ralph Winter, who founded the U.S. Center for World Mission in Pasadena, and I actually ended up marrying his youngest daughter, Tricia. But I had always had a great interest in mathematics and science, but never really saw the intersection of those with mission or, with global Christianity. So I was really thrilled to find ways in which I could put to use the mathematical studies and formulas and that sort of a thing, and relate it to global Christianity. So, in fact, one of the first things that I did with him is to do a statistical comparison of the student volunteer movement 100 years ago with the current Urbana meetings. And one of the surprising things is that because of the massive increase of students around the world over the last 100 years, the proportion of students who were involved in the student volunteer movement was 10 or 15 times higher than it is currently. The meetings were 5,000, 8,000 people, but hardly anybody was going to college. So the coverage of that movement was just enormous. And somewhere I have a graph showing that difference, but that was one of the first projects that I worked on.
I actually hadn't thought about that. So the student volunteer movement was actually far more influential in the U.S. college scene back in that day than the movements that we have today, because of just the differences in population.
Right. Yeah. It's the numerical side of it is pretty clear.
Right.
What the influence is another question.
Right. True.
Looked into, but yeah, that was the basic idea.
Well, I did want to say I saw you guys are holding your 50-year anniversary for research that started somewhat with David Barrett back in the day.
That's right. We located documents here which show that Barrett started his research in somewhere around March of 1965. And we realized that was 50 years ago, so we're going to celebrate and commemorate that up here in March. Barrett, of course, at that time, he was living in Nairobi, Kenya, and he actually did his first project not on East Africa, but on West Africa. And he published a survey of churches and tribes and evangelization in West Africa in 1965. And that grew into further research on African independent churches, which was his dissertation. And then that grew into the World Christian Encyclopedia.
Yeah, which I have a copy. Well, I don't see it on my wall just at the moment, but I do have a copy of his original dissertation. And of course, I've got a copy of the first edition of the encyclopedia. So that kind of segues into, can you briefly describe, for people who aren't very familiar with the process, how do you count Christians around the world?
Right. So really the challenge is making sense of a lot of data that's already collected. So one might think we go out and physically try to count people, but actually governments, let's say, they collect a lot of information. Half of the censuses in the world have a religion question where someone's going to click a box that says Christian. So that's one way we find out something. And then there's lots of surveys and polls, and that is also very helpful. But the churches themselves collect a lot of information. So we have handbooks from all over the world. The Catholic Church in India, the Orthodox Church in Turkey, which is quite small, but they produce something, and Lutherans in Tanzania, and African independent churches across the continent, and Pentecostals in Brazil, and so on. Mm-hmm. So between information collected by governments and by pollsters and information collected by the religious communities, that gives you a pretty good start. And then that you couldn't really put together an absolutely complete picture of Christianity from that. You also need people who do studies of particular churches, and that there's a lot of those out there. And then finally, it's good to know people in all of these places. So you can ask, why did this show this number, for Presbyterians, and this other report was twice as much, and because there's inconsistencies all over the world. But so between these different sources, and we list 13 of them in a book that we wrote last year saying how we do this. Mm-hmm. There, 13 different sources. Then the real challenge is just to make sense of it. To try to figure out why the numbers differ from, in different places. And some of these differing numbers are very important. They're numbers that are in the news every day. And one example is Christians in Egypt. Egypt's been in the news a lot for the last several years with the Arab Spring. And you'll see that the government of Egypt takes a census, and they say it's now 5% of the country that's Christian. But the Christians claim, 15 and sometimes 20%. And we've investigated this as thoroughly as we can, and we have informants and contacts in Egypt, and we think it's about 10%. And I suppose in this case, that's a number that's used a lot. The BBC will say 10%. Mm-hmm. Occasionally someone will say it's 5%, but I think most of us don't believe it's actually that low. We think it's higher. And of course, this is mainly Coptic Orthodox Christians who've been there for 20 centuries. So that's some of these numbers are actually quite significant in international relations and in the news and that sort of a thing.
Sure. So, a similar situation I've just been looking at again is the situation in India, where the government there consistently undercounts the number of Christians as well.
Right.
So you get that kind of thing. Okay, so there's another number that comes out of the research that you guys do, and that's the number of unevangelized. So let's talk a bit about how you calculate that.
Okay, that goes back to once you've counted the Christians, then maybe the next question is to ask what evangelistic resources have they produced, and who are they evangelizing, and so on. And this is a matter of usually of language, since most of these things are done in a particular language. So over the years, David Barrett began to collect this kind of information, like the status of Bible translations and radio broadcasting and church planting and all sorts of things. And so by the time we got to, let's say, to our book, World Christian Trends, which you were involved in, then we had identified 20 factors, 20 things that you could measure when you're trying to see the extent of evangelization in a people. And from those 20 things, we developed a formula. So in a sense, you start with the Christian population, and then you build layers, maybe 20 layers, you could say. And each of these layers is a certain percentage of the rest of the people in that particular people group. Because again, it's done by language, so we measure at the level of people groups or ethno-linguistic groups. And then as you add those layers, saying, okay, here's how many are likely to be evangelized by the Bible being in their language, and so on. Then finally, you get a number, and that's actually the number that we calculate, which is, how many non-Christians have been evangelized, or have likely is a better. With a number of people who have not been evangelized, and that's the concept of the unevangelized.
We had a little bit of a glitch there, so let me back up. The number. So you calculate the number of people who've been evangelized as a result of these ministries, and we should note that, as you were saying, with the numbers of Christians, those numbers of people evangelized by certain ministries, that's based on studies that have been done of the effectiveness of those tools. So
right.
There's studies of, if the Jesus film is active or if the Bible is present, there's a study that says, as a result of that, conservatively speaking, this number of people are affected.
Yeah, we try to be conservative, and it's sort of under normal circumstances, this would be what happens. We also, I should mention, we know that almost nowhere in the world is it normal. So we added 3 negative factors. If you have persecution, if you have, low literacy, and a few other things that tend to impact whether or not, evangelization is successful or goes out. So this is really just a way to estimate the situation, because you can't. I mean, the proper way to do this would be to go to every single people in the world and survey, and even then, who knows if you'd get answers that were honest or whatever. So this is a broad estimation, but it does then give us 3 categories which we've used throughout the years. One is the Christians, which is where we started. The next is evangelized non-Christians, and then unevangelized. So you have those 3 different groups, and you have those groups in every single people group in the world. And of course, that's how you get our estimate of how many people have been evangelized, which we've been publishing really for the last 25 years now, 25, 30 years.
And which is now, I think, 2.3 billion?
Well, it's in our latest
right.
publication, the International Bulletin of Missionary Research. It's somewhere around there.
Yeah, and it's going up.
Yeah, it's creeping up because of population growth. And one thing that I think is happening is, there's been a lot of successful missionary work and evangelistic work in the last couple of decades. So it's a little surprising, how could this still be going up, the number of unevangelized? But I think what it is that the very hardest situations are still the ones that have the least effort among them, and so in a sense we've saved the hardest for last, which is usually not a good idea. But
yeah.
And so what that means is that with pretty high birth rates in these places, that it's really hard to catch up at the end, you might say, after having made really remarkable progress in the growth of Christianity around the world in the 20th century, and with a lot of missionary work at the throughout the 20th century, but even at the end and the beginning of our 21st century. Anybody who knows anything about missions knows this is a pretty exciting time. There's a lot happening, and it's not, it's really not limited to Western agencies sending people, but now there's people from everywhere going everywhere, as you well know.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting mix of a story. It's very exciting. You can report on a lot of progress, but there's still difficulties, and maybe you can sort of compare this to attempts to eradicate disease or to get rid of poverty, and there have been remarkable achievements in those areas too. But it's really hard to get to the people who've had the least attention.
Yeah,
so I think that explains some of it.
Yeah. So now this 86% number, it got a lot of it still gets a lot of attention, I think. It's one of the things that I talk with people about frequently. And the original way that I had seen it was 86% of Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists don't personally know a Christian. It's actually more broader than that. But let's start with, how did you get the idea to calculate this number?
Yeah, well, it's actually directly related to what we were just talking about, and that is, we noticed as we were putting together these 20 factors of how Christians evangelize, that two of the factors were what we would consider internal evangelization within a people group, and a lot of the others were more external, even though, well, Bible translation sometimes takes place outside and then,
Right.
is then utilized, in the group. These evangelistic factors are very closely related to the people themselves reaching out, and so what that did, it gave me the idea, and we began to talk about internal and external evangelization. Although it's not something that we published a lot about, we were just thinking about it. And then someone came along several years ago and asked me, how many, what percentage of Muslims have a Christian friend? That was the question I was asked. And I said, they said, could you possibly guess or have any way of knowing? And I said, oh, we have no way of knowing what that is. But then I realized that wasn't quite right, because we had made estimates, like in a Muslim people group where most people are Muslims, we had made estimates of how many Christians were there. And then we had these two layers of outreach, of contact, really. It was a discipleship, contact, that kind of a thing. And it occurred to me that, well, those are the people that, if you're going to try to guess or estimate, those are the people within those layers, those two layers, who would be most likely to know Christians, to have Christian friends. I mean, you can use different phrases here. And again, it's an estimation that, we don't know for sure.
Right.
But I thought maybe this would work. So I actually, Peter Crossing, who our data analyst, and I worked out a formula for how we could figure out, how many people were in those two layers, beyond Christianity, but obviously not very far, usually, into the rest of the people group. And that was the beginning of this calculation. And I ran it by people all over the world. I said, here's the result we got for your people. Does this sound reasonable to you? So that was the only thing we could do, since there really isn't survey work that's been done. Mm-hmm. Although there is now more in the United States. I don't know, people have been asking these kind of questions. Do you know someone in another religion, and that sort of thing? So we're getting a little more data, but mainly in the Western world. And where this is most interesting is in the rest of the world. So, but anyway, I had many, many people tell me, yeah, that sounds about right. Or hardly anybody told me that it was too much, in the sense of that we were overestimating the number who had friends. Mm-hmm. So, and this is the opposite of what you started out with. So what we're saying is 14% of all Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists in the world have a Christian friend, or have. I think we're using the language personally know a Christian.
Right. Not necessarily a friend, but at least personally.
Yeah, but I mean, there's many different ways you can talk about it, and it is, again, just a rough estimate of the situation. And I think the phrase, personally know, or what has been the thing that has gained the most traction in the press, so to speak, or among mission mobilizers and that sort of a thing. So I've had a few people tell me it's too high. In other words, the 14% is too high. But I've never had anybody tell me it's too low. So in a sense, 86% is probably a conservative estimate. It probably is a little higher. And you might know, all over the world, there have been studies of one kind or another showing the lack of contact between people in different religions, and that affects Christianity as well.
Sure, there
So,
was one done by
yeah,
Pew I saw not too long back. It's been kind of tweeted around a lot. There's a thing where they show most Christians are in Christian countries, most Muslims are in Muslim countries, and there's
right.
not that overlap. So most Christians are in a majority Christian setting. They're not. I think that's the way that goes.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's part of the dynamic behind this. Um, now the data that we published, and it's most complete in our atlas, where we have published a very nice global table broken down by religion in one direction and by United Nations regions in the other. So you can say, what is our estimate, for the number of Hindus who know a Christian in Europe? I mean, we have it like that. And just generally speaking, the way this formula works, it tends to be higher. The number is higher in Christian contexts. And that's, so in other words, if we say it's 14%, on average, it's actually a little lower. It might be as low as 10% in some of the core regions of these religions. So it isn't an even 14%. It's actually quite a bit lower, like in Saudi Arabia or someplace like that.
Right.
Whereas, if you go to Britain or Norway or the United States, the numbers for Muslims who know a Christian are a lot higher, given this formula. And that may or may not be the case. I think it is higher, but whether it's as high as we say it is. And those are more likely to be tested by polls, because almost all the polls and surveys are done in the Western world. So would be interesting to follow
Why
that.
would it be? Why would it be that, for example, you think in America you've got a Muslim diaspora, generally speaking. Part of it is a diaspora, and part of it is some internal growth in Islam. But there's a lot of Christians in America.
Right.
So,
Right.
what would be the situation in which a Muslim in America would be less likely that they would know a believer?
No, it's the other way around. They're much more likely
More
in the
likely,
United
okay.
States. Yeah, which I think is something you would guess would be the case. But
Okay.
there's still an alarming gap in friendship and hospitality between Christians and Muslims in the United States. I mean, that's been a problem. But like when we did a course at my church on world religions, we originally thought, we kind of live away from Boston far enough that, there's not a lot of diversity way out here, even though Boston itself is one of, very diverse. But the first thing that happened is we said, the first day, how many of you have coworkers that are Muslims, Hindus, or Buddhists? And almost everybody raised their hand. So, and they work in all these different industries, and they go into Boston or even stay up in this area, and the guy I work with is a Muslim, and this woman is a Hindu that I work with. So there's actually quite a bit of interaction within people's work situations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of contact we're talking about, because generally if you're working with somebody every day, that's somebody, that's, you could say friendship, but at least there's personal contact and knowing. So
Right. So one of the ways that this number is usually cited is I've seen it most cited is 86% of Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists don't personally know a believer. So is there a significant difference between, I guess I thought when I first saw it in the latest 2015 issue of the Status of Global Mission, it said 14% do know a believer, which is obvious, 86-14, but then it said 14% of all non-Christians. And I thought, but then I realized, of course, most non-Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists make up most of the non-Christians, so it would make sense that way. But is there a difference between the percentage of Muslim, Hindus, Buddhists that don't know or that do know a believer, or however you want to phrase that, and atheists and agnostics, their situation?
Yeah, there is a big difference. The 14% is a little unfortunate of a coincidence, because we originally published this 86% back in 2007. Mm-hmm. That's when we first did it. And then by the time we got to the Atlas, you could see that there was a clear difference between the Hindu, Buddhist, and Muslim situation and other religions. And actually the atheist agnostic one is quite interesting because apart from China, which complicates this, but in the Western world, most atheists and agnostics know Christians in their family, in their colleagues and so on, and many of them were Christians previously and have become agnostic, mainly agnostic, and then some have gone all the way to atheism.
Mm-hmm.
But they're very likely to know Christians. So those numbers are quite high, except China is the place where there's more atheists and agnostics than anyone, and they're not as likely to know Christians, even though the church has been growing, quite a bit in China. So in one sense, you have to say there's let's say atheists and agnostics in the Western world are very likely to know Christians, whereas atheists and agnostics in Asia, or particularly in China, are not so likely. And in fact, they drag the number down because there's so many of them.
Right.
But I think you're right that certain religions have more contact than, and the ones that are highlighted in missions mobilization tend to be the Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu.
Right.
And they are the ones with the least contact. So that number reflects that.
Well, why do you think there's so little contact between Christians and non-Christians?
Well, I think the main reason is something you touched on earlier, and that is, and this is changing. So I think that there's a good news ahead in this. But all the Christians lived 100 years ago. All the Christians lived in one place, and all the Muslims lived in another. So it was even worse, 100 years ago, because they just didn't live together except in certain places. Whereas now there's a lot more mixing going on with migration and that sort of a thing. And secondly, so people from these religions are now living all over the world much closer to Christians. So that's why it might be starting to go up a bit. But then Christians are beginning to appear in many of these countries where they never were before. So a Hindu in Nepal, let's say, 60, 80 years ago had a very little chance ever of meeting a Christian, but now there's a lot of Christians in Nepal, and so that increases their chances quite a bit. But the reason that there's such a big gap is that religionists were kind of cordoned off in people groups. I mean, most people in this group are Muslim, most people in this group are Christian, and so on. So, and that makes it difficult, because then you have to cross a cultural barrier just to meet somebody even.
Right.
So I think that's the simplest explanation. There's probably a lot of other things that are going on underneath it. But so in discussing, the future of this statistic, I think it's rather encouraging, because now we have a lot better chance of people at least meeting each other. Whether they actually spend any time together is another thing. And there's a lot of books out there now and encouragement for Christians to know more about these other religions, and then also to spend more time with people in these religions. Especially in the Western world now, there's a lot of books out there encouraging people to do it. And in our little church up here and far away from cosmopolitan Boston, we had a very, very successful time with that, because people are eager, actually, Christians are eager to make more friends, and not solely for evangelistic purposes, but simply to be, for society to function better, since it is more diverse now than it ever has been.
So you see the movement of diasporas to be something of a really truly something of a strategic opportunity if we were to take advantage of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Last question. Well, two final questions. What do you think? What do you think that the takeaway for this 86%, 14%, the implications, the so what would be?
Right. Well, no, it's actually pretty straightforward. And in the place which we originally published this, which was in 2007 in Evangelical Missions Quarterly, we actually devoted half of the article to the theological rationale for why this was even important to measure. And at the heart of it is it's quite interesting, and that is that Christianity is incarnational in nature. I mean, in other words, Jesus himself came and lived among us and knew us, you might say, and so that what that means is that a statistic showing the lack of contact, the lack of human contact, is really worrying, because our faith is the opposite. It's a faith of contact, of human contact, of hospitality, friendship, good news, preaching the good news, and all of that. It's a human activity, one person to person, you might say. So, and of course, this isn't to downgrade the value of radio and the internet and television, and so or even
Right.
books. You can read a book without anybody else being around, but in the end, human contact, face-to-face contact, personal contact, that's what we settled on, is actually quite important to Christians. It's really at the heart of who we are. We're meant to be in friendship with people, all people. So that's kind of the so what side of it, is that it has a theological basis. Obviously you can bring mission in, and that's important, but even just a straight biblical concept of hospitality and incarnation and so on shows us that this is something that we should be concerned about. And then of course the thing to do about it is to encourage Christians to have more contact and to do hospitality. And I'm sure you've heard that a large percentage, people say maybe 3/4 of all international students who come to the United States never set foot in an American home.
Yeah.
And most of those homes are Christian, So, and Tricia and I, my wife and I, every Thanksgiving, every Easter, we bring international students to our home because Tricia teaches them. And this last time we had people from Turkey, Morocco, Japan, Peru, and most of them had been in the United States about 2 or 3, some 4 years. And we went around the table and we said, have any of you ever been in an American home? And none of them had. We've done this for 10 years, and every year it's the same. None of them have been invited. So that's a place to start, is just to have people over, and people love it. It's such an honor to do. And you probably know, when you travel around the rest of the world, you get invited into people's homes. So it's a little strange not to be invited. And so I think there's, training that has to go on in that area of just, helping people to be better at contact.
One of my favorite verses, I think, that's the way it's translated in the Message is the way I really appreciate it, is it's the verse in the first chapter of John. It goes, the word put on flesh, and I believe the word put on flesh and moved into the neighborhood.
Right.
And I really like that because it conveys something that you don't get outside of that translation. But what strikes me is that as you're talking about, diasporas coming here and never being invited into an American home, you could kind of, in a way, reverse that. Because Jesus said, as you do it unto the least of these, you do it to me. And so in a sense, they are moving into our neighborhoods. You can view it as an opportunity to do to Christ as do it unto the least of these. And I'm always staggered by the idea that there's so many internationals come here, and so many spend their entire time here, and so many leave, never really having been, and that opportunity is there. So,
right.
So last one that I always ask people is, for you, in the role that you have, why do you do what you do? As a researcher, as somebody involved in this, what's the motivation? Why do you do what you do?
Yeah, I think because we're an academic institution, even though we have a very wide audience ranging from church and mission leaders, as we've sort of been talking about here, to journalists, to academics, students, graduate students, many others. I feel like we're doing this first and foremost to make sure that whoever is listening to us is getting as accurate and helpful information as they can get. And we do so we want Muslims, Muslims in the Gulf states, to when they see our figures for Christians in Saudi Arabia, which they do, we want them to have a sense that, yeah, this makes sense. It's trustworthy. Once they get past the idea that there might even be Christians in Saudi Arabia,
right?
Of course, and most of them are Filipinos and so on. So I think providing accurate information is a deep underlying motivation for us. That doesn't mean all the information that comes out of here is accurate. That's a big challenge in itself. But at least we're motivated for that. And then, of course, the second layer to that is that we think decisions made by mission agencies, by churches, by leaders of NGOs and so on in the Christian global Christian mission enterprise, let's say, that those are going to be better made if there's better information to base them on. So we are very hopeful that people will utilize the information to make wise decisions, and I think that really, in the end, is what motivates us here. Yeah.
Great. Todd is a very good friend, dear friend of mine, has been for a very long time. I will mention the Atlas book that he's talked about. I've got my own copy. And you guys are looking toward, eventually, the next edition of the World Christian Encyclopedia, correct?
Yeah, that's right. No, we're actually working on it. I was working on it right before you called. I was editing some text in Afghanistan. So we're going through, just beginning the process of going through and updating all of that. And if all goes well, should be out in about 2020. That'll
be great. It's always something that we look forward to. And then every year, of course, the status of global mission gets published in the International Bulletin of Mission Research and is linked to you guys' website, which has a number of resources as well. And I'll put the URL up for that at the end of the video.
Great.
Todd, thanks. I really appreciate you taking the time to, away from Afghanistan, to talk with us about the 86% number.
Thank you.